The November rain drummed against the grimy windows of Bleakwood Orphanage like skeletal fingers tapping an endless, mournful rhythm. Inside the cold stone walls, 17-year-old Rosalind Hartwell sat in the punishment cell, her wrists bound with rough rope that had left angry red marks on her pale skin. The cell was barely large enough for a person to lie down, with walls that wept moisture and a floor covered in moldy straw that hadn't been changed in weeks. She had been confined here for 3 days now, her crime being nothing more than attempting to comfort little Timothy when he'd cried for his deceased mother during the night. Mrs. Blackthorne, the cruel headmistress who ruled Bleakwood with an iron fist, had declared such disruption unacceptable and sentenced Rosalind to isolation as an example to the other children. The orphanage had been Rosalind's prison for 12 years, ever since her parents had perished in a carriage accident when she was just 5 years old. She had no memory of relatives who might have claimed her, no knowledge of any inheritance that might have provided for her care. All she knew was the grey existence within these walls, where children learned quickly that hope was a luxury they couldn't afford. Mrs. Blackthorne took particular pleasure in tormenting Rosalind, perhaps because the girl refused to be completely broken despite years of harsh treatment. Where other children had learned to keep their heads down and their voices silent, Rosalind still dared to speak up when she witnessed injustice. She still shared her meager portions with smaller children, still whispered stories to comfort those who cried in the darkness. "You think yourself better than your station." Mrs. Blackthorne had hissed just that morning when she'd brought Rosalind's daily ration of thin gruel and stale bread. "But you're nothing, girl. Nothing but an unwanted burden that this institution feeds out of Christian charity." You do well to remember that, but Rosalind did remember something else, fragments of a time before Bleakwood, when gentle hands had tucked her into a warm bed and loving voices had sung her to sleep. She remembered the scent of roses from a garden she could barely picture and the sound of laughter that seemed to come from another lifetime. These memories, hazy as they were, had sustained her through the darkest moments and kept alive a spark of defiance that Mrs. Blackthorne couldn't extinguish. Now, as she sat in the punishment cell with her hands bound, Rosalind found herself wondering if this time might finally break her spirit. The cold had seeped into her bones and her stomach cramped with hunger. More than the physical discomfort, though, was the crushing weight of hopelessness that threatened to engulf her completely. Outside her tiny window, she could see the iron gates that surrounded the orphanage grounds like the bars of an enormous cage. Beyond them lay the village of Millbrook, with its cobblestone streets and warm cottage windows that glowed like beacons in the darkness. She had never been beyond those gates, never walked freely through the world that existed just out of reach. At 17, she was considered too old for adoption, but too young to simply be turned out into the world without resources. Mrs. Blackthorne had made it clear that Rosalind's future lay in becoming a servant in some household that would accept an orphan with no references and no family to vouch for her character. It was a fate that awaited all the children of Bleakwood, to trade one form of servitude for another, carrying the stain of their origins wherever they went. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside made Rosalind's heart race with dread. It was well past the evening meal, and visitors to the punishment cells at this hour usually meant more suffering was about to be inflicted. She pressed herself against the far wall and tried to make herself as small as possible, a survival instinct honed by years of experience. But instead of Mrs. Blackthorne's harsh voice, she heard something unexpected, the deep, cultured tones of a gentleman speaking in low, urgent conversation with someone else. "This is completely unacceptable," the man was saying, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "How long has this child been confined in such conditions?" "Your Grace must understand," came the oily reply that Rosalind recognized as belonging to Mr. Grimsby, the orphanage's administrator. "The girl is incorrigible. We've tried everything to correct her rebellious nature, but she continues to disrupt the orderly functioning of our institution. And your solution is to treat her like a common criminal. The gentleman's voice had grown cold with disapproval. She's little more than a child herself. Rosalind pressed her ear to the door, hardly daring to breathe. No one had ever spoken in her defense before, especially not someone whose voice carried such obvious authority. Who was this stranger, and why was he concerning himself with the affairs of Bleakwood Orphanage? "Perhaps your Grace would prefer to discuss this matter in my office," Mr. Grimsby suggested nervously. "These cellars are hardly suitable for a gentleman of your standing." "No," the stranger replied firmly. "I want to see the conditions for myself. Open this door immediately." Rosalind heard the rattle of keys, and then the heavy wooden door swung open to reveal two figures silhouetted against the flickering torchlight of the corridor. Mr. Grimsby, a thin man with greasy hair and nervous eyes, cowered slightly behind a tall gentleman whose very presence seemed to command the space around him. The gentleman stepped into the cell, and Rosalind caught her first clear look at him. He was perhaps 30 years of age, with dark hair and the kind of aristocratic features that spoke of generations of noble breeding. His clothes were clearly expensive, a perfectly tailored coat of midnight blue, pristine white linen, and boots polished to mirror brightness. But it was his eyes that captured her attention most completely. They were a deep grey, like storm clouds, and they blazed with an anger that made even Mr. Grimsby take a step backward. "Dear God," the gentleman breathed, taking in the cramped, filthy cell and Rosalind's bound hands. "This is barbaric beyond belief." He knelt beside her without regard for his expensive clothing, his hands moving gently to examine the ropes around her wrists. His touch was careful and respectful, so different from the rough handling she was accustomed to that it brought tears to her eyes. "What is your name, child?" he asked softly, his earlier anger giving way to something infinitely gentler. "Rosalind, sir," she whispered, her voice hoarse from days of speaking to no one but herself. Rosalind Hartwell. Something flickered in his eyes at the mention of her surname, recognition, perhaps, or surprise. But before she could analyze it further, he was turning back to Mr. Grimsby with renewed fury. "Release her hands immediately," he commanded, his voice cutting through the damp air like a blade. "And explain to me how any institution claiming to care for children justifies such treatment. Your Grace, you don't understand the full situation," Mr. Grimsby stammered, producing a key to unlock Rosalind's bonds. "The girl is a troublemaker, always stirring up the other children, refusing to accept her place. We must maintain discipline or chaos would ensue." "Her place," the Duke repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "And what place would that be exactly?" As the ropes fell away from her wrists, Rosalind rubbed the circulation back into her hands while listening to this extraordinary exchange. Never in her 12 years at Bleakwood had anyone questioned the methods used to control the children. They existed at the mercy of Mrs. Blackthorne and her staff, with no one to advocate for their welfare or challenge the harsh conditions of their daily lives. "She's an orphan, Your Grace," Mr. Grimsby said, as if that explained everything. "No family, no prospects, no inheritance. The parish pays for her keep, but barely enough to cover the basics. We do what we can, but resources are limited, and order must be maintained." The Duke studied Rosalind's face in the flickering torchlight, and she saw something in his expression that she had almost forgotten existed: genuine compassion. "How long have you been at this institution, Miss Hartwell?" he asked gently. 12 years, sir," she replied, surprised by her own boldness in speaking directly to someone of such obvious importance. "Since I was 5 years old, and in all that time, has anyone investigated your background, attempted to trace your family connections, or determine if there might be resources available for your care?" Rosalind shook her head, confused by the questions. "I was told my parents died with no relatives and no money. Sir, Mrs. Blackthorne says I should be grateful for Christian charity and not ask questions about things that can't be changed." The Duke's jaw tightened, and he rose to his full impressive height to face Mr. Grimsby once more. I want to see every record you have regarding Miss Hartwell's placement here, he said with quiet authority. Every document, every correspondence, everything. Your Grace, surely such details are of no interest to someone of your standing, Mr. Grimsby protested weakly. The girl is no one of consequence. That, the Duke interrupted coldly, remains to be determined. But I can tell you with absolute certainty that no child, regardless of their circumstances, deserves to be treated like an animal. This institution's methods are a disgrace to the very concept of Christian charity. As Rosalind listened to this remarkable man defend her dignity with such passion, she felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel: hope. But even as that fragile emotion flickered to life in her chest, she tried to crush it down. Hope had disappointed her too many times before, and she couldn't bear to have it shattered again. Yet something about this stranger's presence, the authority in his voice and the genuine concern in his eyes, suggested that perhaps this time might be different. Perhaps this time, someone with the power to change things had finally seen the truth of what happened within Bleakwood's walls. Within an hour, every document related to Rosalind's placement at Bleakwood Orphanage was spread across Mr. Grimsby's desk. The Duke, who had introduced himself as Adrian Blackwood, Duke of Ravenshollow, studied each paper with the intensity of a barrister examining evidence in a crucial case. Rosalind sat quietly in a chair nearby, still hardly believing that this powerful stranger was concerning himself so deeply with her circumstances. Mrs. Blackthorne had been summoned from her private quarters and now stood rigidly beside Mr. Grimsby, her thin face pinched with disapproval at having her authority questioned. She kept shooting venomous glances at Rosalind, as if this entire situation was somehow the girl's fault. According to these records, the Duke said slowly, his voice carefully controlled, Miss Hartwell was brought here 12 years ago by a solicitor representing her deceased parents' estate. The paperwork indicates that her parents were James and Catherine Hartwell of Willowbrook Manor, and that they perished in a carriage accident while travelling to London. Yes, Your Grace, Mr. Grimsby confirmed nervously. A tragic case, but hardly uncommon in these times. The child was left with no family and no inheritance, so the parish arranged for her care here. The Duke looked up from the papers, his grey eyes sharp with intelligence and growing suspicion. Yet there's no record of any investigation into the parents' estate. No inventory of property, no accounting of assets or debts. For a family wealthy enough to own a manor house, this seems unusual. Mrs. Blackthorne shifted uncomfortably. Your Grace, we are merely a charitable institution. Such legal matters were beyond our purview. We simply provided care for an orphan child as requested by the proper authorities. And yet, the Duke continued, picking up another document, I find it curious that the solicitor who arranged Miss Hartwell's placement was one Edgar Thornfield, whose signature appears on several other documents related to property transfers in this county around the same time. Rosalind's heart began to beat faster as she listened to this exchange. She had never heard these details about her parents' death or the circumstances of her placement at Bleakwood. The adults had always spoken around her as if she were too young or too unimportant to understand such matters. Thornfield, the Duke mused, his voice growing harder. Yes, I remember that name now. He was investigated several years ago for fraudulent property dealings. Though the charges were eventually dropped due to lack of evidence, the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as the implications of his words sank in. Mr. Grimsby began to stammer protests, while Mrs. Blackthorne's face had gone pale beneath her stern exterior. Your Grace surely cannot be suggesting— Mr. Grimsby began. I'm not suggesting anything yet, the Duke interrupted coldly. But I am going to conduct a thorough investigation into Miss Hartwell's true circumstances. And until that investigation is complete, she will not be remaining at this institution. But Your Grace, Mrs. Blackthorne protested, finding her voice at last, you cannot simply remove a ward of the parish without proper authorization. There are procedures, legal requirements. "I am well acquainted with legal requirements," the Duke replied with icy precision. "And I am also well acquainted with my rights as a peer of the realm to investigate suspected fraud and to provide protection for those who may have been wronged. Miss Hartwell will be coming with me tonight." Rosalind felt the world tilt around her. Was this really happening? Was this mysterious Duke actually offering to take her away from Bleakwood, away from the cold, the hunger, the endless punishment for daring to show kindness to other children? "I don't understand," she whispered, speaking for the first time since the documents had been produced. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me." The Duke turned to her with an expression that was surprisingly gentle, given the steel she had heard in his voice moments before. "Miss Hartwell, I suspect that you may not be the simple orphan you've been led to believe yourself to be. But even if you were, no child deserves to be treated as you have been here. That alone would be reason enough to intervene." He stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the dark grounds of the orphanage with obvious distaste. "I have seen enough of these institutions to know that not all of them operate with the children's welfare as their primary concern. Some, I'm afraid, are more interested in the parish funds that come with each child than in providing actual care." Mrs. Blackthorn's face flushed red with indignation. "Your Grace, I resent the implication that we have done anything improper. We have provided for this girl for 12 years, asking nothing in return but gratitude and proper behavior." "Proper behavior," the Duke repeated thoughtfully. "And what constitutes improper behavior in your estimation, Mrs. Blackthorn?" "Disrupting the other children, refusing to accept her station, showing defiance toward authority." "In other words," the Duke interrupted, "displaying the kind of spirit and compassion that suggests she was raised with love and care before arriving here. The kind of character that develops in children who are valued and encouraged, not beaten down and told they are worthless." His words hit Rosalind like a physical blow, not because they hurt, but because they validated something she had always felt but never been able to articulate. Despite 12 years at Bleakwood, despite countless punishments and cruel words designed to break her spirit, she had somehow retained a sense of her own worth that refused to be extinguished. "I want to gather a few of my belongings," she said suddenly, surprising herself with her own decisiveness. "Of course," the Duke agreed, "though I suspect whatever you have here will hardly be worth preserving. We'll ensure you have everything you need once we reach Ravenshollow." The word "we" sent a thrill through Rosalind that she tried to suppress. She had learned not to trust in promises of rescue or deliverance. They had a way of evaporating like morning mist, leaving behind only deeper disappointment. 20 minutes later, Rosalind stood in the dormitory where she had spent the last 12 years, looking at the narrow iron bed and thin blanket that had been her only comfort. Her possessions fit easily into a small cloth bundle, a few worn undergarments, a comb with several broken teeth, and most precious of all, a small wooden bird that one of the younger children had carved for her as a thank-you gift. As she prepared to leave Bleakwood forever, Rosalind felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration that left her breathless. The only life she could remember was contained within these grey walls, and stepping beyond them meant venturing into a world she knew nothing about with a man who was still largely a stranger to her. But as she followed the Duke through the corridors toward the main entrance, passing the punishment cells where she had spent so many awful hours, she knew that whatever waited for her beyond these walls had to be better than what she was leaving behind. The Duke's carriage stood waiting in the courtyard, its polished black exterior and fine horses speaking of wealth and status beyond anything Rosalind had ever imagined. As he helped her into the luxurious interior with its soft leather seats and warm woolen blankets, she felt like she was stepping into a fairy tale. "Are you quite certain about this, Your Grace?" she asked, as the carriage began to move, carrying her away from the only home she had ever known. "What if your investigation doesn't find what you think it will? What if I really am just an orphan with no family or fortune?" The Duke settled back against the cushions and studied her face in the soft light from the carriage lanterns. Then you will still have a home at Ravenshollow for as long as you wish it, he said simply. I have more space than I know what to do with, and frankly, the manor has been far too quiet since my wife's death 3 years ago. The casual mention of his personal loss reminded Rosalind that she wasn't the only one who had suffered tragedy. This powerful man who had swept into her life like an avenging angel carried his own sorrows, his own reasons for understanding what it meant to be alone in the world. I'm sorry for your loss, she said softly. The words feeling inadequate but heartfelt. Thank you, he replied. Helena would have been appalled by what I witnessed at Bleakwood tonight. She always said that how a society treats its most vulnerable members reveals its true character. As the carriage rolled through the darkness toward an uncertain but hopeful future, Rosalind found herself thinking about the possibility that her entire understanding of her own history might be built on lies. If the Duke's suspicions were correct, if there had been fraud involved in her placement at Bleakwood, what did that mean for who she really was? But even more than curiosity about her past, she felt gratitude for this unexpected rescue and the chance to discover what kind of person she might become when freed from the crushing weight of Bleakwood's expectations. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and when we reach that milestone, we'll have an incredible surprise waiting for all our loyal viewers. Trust us, you won't want to miss what we have planned. Ravenshollow Manor rose from the morning mist like something from a dream, its elegant Georgian facade and sweeping gardens a stark contrast to the grim walls of Bleakwood Orphanage. As their carriage rolled up the curved drive, Rosalind pressed her face to the window in wonder, hardly able to believe that such beauty existed in the same world as the harsh institution she had called home for 12 years. The Duke had been quiet during the journey, lost in thought as he gazed out at the countryside. But as they approached his ancestral home, he turned to her with something that might have been nervousness in his aristocratic features. I should warn you, he said gently. Ravenshollow may seem overwhelming at first. It's been in my family for generations, and I'm afraid it's rather grand. But I want you to think of it as your home now, Miss Hartwell. You're not a guest or a charity case, you're family. The word family sent a shock through Rosalind's system. In 12 years at Bleakwood, no one had ever used that word in connection with her. She had been an obligation, a burden, a problem to be managed, but never family. Mrs. Crawford, the Duke's housekeeper, met them at the front door with a warm smile and kind eyes that immediately put Rosalind at ease. She was a motherly woman with greying hair and the sort of competent manner that suggested nothing ever rattled her composure. Your Grace, she said with obvious affection, I've prepared the blue room as you requested, and cook has laid out a proper breakfast. I suspect our young guest might be ready for a good meal. The mention of food made Rosalind's stomach clench with hunger. She had eaten nothing but thin gruel and stale bread for days, and the aroma drifting from the manor's kitchens was almost overwhelming in its richness. But first, the Duke led her to his study, where he had already begun assembling materials for his investigation into her background. Maps, legal documents, and correspondence covered his massive oak desk, and she could see that he approached this mystery with the same methodical intensity he might bring to managing his vast estates. I sent a message ahead to my solicitor in London, he explained, settling into his chair while Rosalind took a seat across from him. He's already begun researching the Hartwell family and their connection to Willowbrook Manor, but I wanted to hear from you first. Do you remember anything about your life before Bleakwood? Anything at all, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant? Rosalind closed her eyes and tried to reach back into the hazy memories of her earliest years. Most of her childhood before the orphanage was a blur of impressions rather than clear recollections, but there were fragments that had always felt important. I remember a garden, she said slowly. Roses, I think, and the smell of lavender. And someone singing to me, a woman's voice, very gentle. There was a piano in a sunny room, and I think someone was teaching me to play simple melodies. The Duke made notes as she spoke, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful. "Do you remember the house itself? Any details about the rooms or the grounds?" "There was a staircase with a carved banister that I liked to slide down when no one was looking," Rosalind said, a small smile crossing her face at the memory. "And a library with tall windows and hundreds of books. I remember being allowed to look at the pictures in some of them. That suggests a family of some education and refinement," the Duke observed. "People who valued learning and culture, hardly the sort who would die destitute." A knock at the study door interrupted their conversation, and Mrs. Crawford entered with a breakfast tray that made Rosalind's eyes widen in amazement. Fresh bread still warm from the oven, eggs cooked to perfection, crispy bacon, sweet butter, and jam that sparkled like jewels in cut crystal jars. "Thank you, Mrs. Crawford," the Duke said warmly. "And perhaps you could arrange for Miss Hartwell to have a hot bath and some proper clothes after she's eaten. I suspect she's been making do with inadequate provisions for far too long." As Rosalind ate with careful restraint, her stomach was so unused to rich food that she dared not rush. The Duke continued his questioning about her memories. Gradually more details emerged. A kind man who had lifted her up to see horses in a stable, the sound of carriage wheels on gravel drives, Christmas mornings with presents wrapped in silk ribbons. "These are not the memories of a poor child," the Duke said with growing certainty. "Everything you describe suggests a comfortable, loving home with parents who doted on you." 3 hours later, Rosalind barely recognized herself in the mirror of the blue room. Mrs. Crawford had provided a bath in a copper tub, filled with hot water scented with lavender, the same scent from her childhood memories, and a dress of soft green wool that fit her perfectly, despite having belonged to the Duke's late wife. "His Grace thought you might be of a similar size to her ladyship," Mrs. Crawford explained kindly. "She was a lovely woman, and I think she would have been pleased to know her clothes were helping someone in need." When Rosalind returned to the study, she found the Duke poring over a letter that had just arrived by special messenger. His expression was grim, and she felt her stomach clench with sudden anxiety. "What is it?" she asked, settling into her chair with far more grace than she had possessed that morning. "Bad news?" "In a sense," the Duke replied, looking up at her with eyes that blazed with anger, "but also vindication of my suspicions. My solicitor has been quite busy this morning." He held up the letter, his jaw tight with controlled fury. "It seems that Willowbrook Manor was indeed owned by James and Catherine Hartwell, your parents. But contrary to what you were told, they did not die impoverished. The estate was worth a considerable sum, including the manor house, extensive lands, and substantial investments." Rosalind felt the room spin around her. "But I don't understand. If my parents had money, why was I sent to Bleakwood? Why was I told they left nothing?" "Because," the Duke said grimly, "the solicitor Edgar Thornfield, who arranged your placement at the orphanage, also happened to be the administrator of your parents' estate. According to the records my man uncovered, Thornfield claimed that all assets had to be sold to pay debts, and that nothing remained for your care. But that wasn't true. Far from it. The estate was sold, certainly, to a buyer who happened to be Thornfield's brother-in-law for a sum far below its actual value. The proceeds, along with your parents' other assets, simply disappeared into Thornfield's own accounts." The magnitude of the betrayal hit Rosalind like a physical blow. For 12 years, she had lived in poverty and misery, while the man entrusted with her welfare had stolen her rightful inheritance and condemned her to a life of servitude. "So I really am," she began, oddly daring to voice the thought. "You are the rightful heir to the Hartwell fortune," the Duke confirmed, "or what remains of it after Thornfield's theft. My solicitor estimates that even after his embezzlement, your inheritance should be substantial enough to provide you with independence and security for life." Rosalind stared at him in shock, trying to process this complete reversal of everything she had believed about herself and her circumstances. But more than that, the Duke continued, his expression softening. "You are exactly who I suspected you were from the moment I met you. A young woman of breeding and character who was robbed not just of her fortune, but of her rightful place in the world. What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now," the Duke said with satisfaction, "we ensure that justice is served. Thornfield will face charges for fraud and embezzlement, and we'll work to recover whatever remains of your inheritance. But regardless of what we're able to retrieve financially, you have something far more valuable, the truth about who you are." As the full impact of this revelation settled over her, Rosalind felt something shift inside her chest. The scared, powerless girl who had been shackled in Bleakwood's punishment cell was gone forever, replaced by a young woman who knew her own worth and her rightful place in the world. "Thank you," she said, meeting the Duke's eyes with newfound confidence. "Not just for rescuing me, but for believing I was worth rescuing. For seeing something in me that I had almost forgotten existed. I saw exactly what your parents saw when they held you as a child," the Duke replied gently. "A daughter worthy of love, protection, and every opportunity life could offer. That's who you've always been, Miss Hartwell, even when the world tried to convince you otherwise." 6 months later, as Rosalind stood in the garden at Ravens Hollow Manor, watching the Duke teach the orphan children they had rescued from Bleakwood how to tend the roses, she marveled at how completely her life had transformed. Edgar Thornfield was awaiting trial, Mrs. Blackthorne had been dismissed in disgrace, and the Bleakwood Orphanage had been completely reformed under new, caring management. Her inheritance had been largely recovered, making her a woman of independent means. But more importantly, she had found her true calling in working alongside the Duke to protect vulnerable children throughout the county. Together, they had established new standards for orphan care and created scholarship programs to ensure that every child, regardless of their circumstances, had access to education and opportunity. But perhaps most precious of all, she had found the family she had never expected to have again, not just in the Duke, who had become like a beloved older brother, but in the community of rescued children who now filled Ravens Hollow's halls with laughter and hope. Standing in the garden, where the scent of roses brought back her earliest, happiest memories, Rosalind finally understood that sometimes the darkest chapters of our lives are simply the prelude to the most beautiful stories yet to be written. Thank you so much for following Rosalind's incredible journey from despair to triumph with us. If you've enjoyed this story, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We're so close to reaching 1,000 subscribers, and when we do, we have an absolutely amazing surprise planned for our community, something that will take your breath away. Hit that subscribe button and join our growing family of story lovers. You won't want to miss what we have in store.